All right, everyone, welcome. For our first video series for our new units, we're going to start with Unit 1, and we're going to do topics 1.1 on ecosystems, and then this is also going to cover the slides related to 1.8 primary productivity, as well as the slides that follow on trophic levels and on food webs. As always, we're going to give some credit to Mr. Smeeds. All of his information is here. His own YouTube channel, his Instagram, Apes versus Everybody, has a lot of helpful information related to our AP environmental science topics. All of our slides for each topic within each unit are going to have learning objectives and essential knowledge. These are definitely worth reviewing because these are basically the big highlights for each subtopic that we're going to have to do. And in Unit 1, we have 11 of these. So topic 1.1 covers the basics of ecosystems. I hope that most of this is a review. The biggest thing with the slides on this topic are understanding when you're writing for open-ended questions what needs to go where. So we wouldn't say a community as it relates to one species. For example, the elk given here, we wouldn't say a community of elk, that's a population. If we're talking about all of the living organisms that in an area across different species, then we would refer to it as a community. And then when we say ecosystem, we're talking about everything, the living and non-living portions of that environment. You see it also mentions biomes here. Those are going to be covered in those are part of Unit 1, but we're going to cover those in a later video. This chart summarizes our organism interactions, which are definitely worth knowing what relates to what. Mainly the summary here for how species are affected during each one of these interactions. Competition is highlighted here, and each one is defined. So competition means going over, fighting over any kind of shared or limited resource. We'll talk about that on the next slide. And then the other one's predation, mutualism, and commensalism, the same thing. Each one has their own slide dedicated to it. But it is worth noting and recognizing from this chart which interactions are positive for one organism and which ones are either positive, negative, or no impact is given. In predation, true predation is what we typically think of with predator and prey interactions, where one organism eats and kills the other one in that relationship. But the way it's defined for our class, any interaction where one is beneficial and one is negative is considered predation. That's going to include herbivorous organisms that eat plants, even though they're not killing the plant, they're just eating part of it most of the time as part of that interaction within the food web. It's still considered predation for us. And parasitism is not typically thought of as predation because we're not usually going to see parasites that kill their host organism. But as far as the interaction goes, it does fall under this category of one organism benefiting and one organism being harmed. In this case, the host is harmed, even though it might not necessarily be killed. So we have true parasites that are shown here with the lampreys on this fish, and we also have parasitoids, which are common. Parasitic wasps shown here in this image. Parasitoids actually are going to be useful when we talk about integrated pest management in our agriculture unit later this year. Now, in the case where one organism is not harmed, we have two examples. We have mutualism. So in the case of mutualism, both organisms are going to benefit. One good example that's shown here has to do with corals and algae. Coral are actually animals. They're animal cells they consume. And the way that this is looked at as mutualism is because the corals are helping the algae by providing reef structure, meaning that they spread out, they have hard outer shells that protect them, and that creates a substrate, it's a material for the algae to grab onto. And then the algae, through photosynthesis, provide food and sugars for the coral, which can then be used as energy. So these two organisms are mutually benefiting each other. There's a number of other examples across environmental science. One that's a little bit more animal-animal, as opposed to an animal-plant relationship we see here. would be egrets and cattle. So a cattle egret is a bird that will basically perch itself on top of the cows. It eats, ticks and flies and things that might potentially be parasites or things that might try and burrow into the cattle's hide. So the egrets get food in that relationship, and the cattle get protection from nuisance pests that might otherwise disrupt them. Now, in the case of competition, where both organisms are quote unquote harmed, what we really are seeing is neither organism benefits to the fullest extent because they're competing over some limited resource. The way that this typically solves itself in nature is through what's called resource partitioning. And in resource partitioning, organisms are still using the same resource just in different ways, and that helps to reduce competition. There's a couple of more advanced examples that are given here, but to simplify this, partitioning can exist by feeding potentially at different times or being active at different times of the day, whether it's daytime versus nighttime, but still using the same resource, whether that's space or food. Spatial partitioning is shown in the image here, where we have different birds that will use the three-dimensional verticality of a tree and nest in different areas, whether it's on the sides, more inner, near the top, near the bottom. So they're still using the same resource, but they are not interacting with each other. And then morphological is typically what we see when it comes to food resources. So in morphological partitioning, organisms might, based on what they're more suited for, and this would lead into some of our discussion of speciation and adaptations in Unit 2, they will use more, excuse me, they will use whatever food source is easier for them to access. So an example of this could be feeding on different size seeds rather than competing for all of the seeds from a particular plant. In the case of many birds, some species might tend for the smaller seeds, and some species might tend for larger ones, and then over time, their adaptations make them more suited for that. So the organisms that are eating the smaller seeds will have adaptations over time through evolution that make them more adept, better at feeding on those smaller seeds, and likewise for the ones with the larger seeds. Going back 1 second, because I realized that the only thing that wasn't highlighted specifically in here was the idea of commensalism. So in commensalism, simply put, we have organisms where one is going to benefit and the other organism is receives no benefit from the interaction. So sharks and remoras are a good example of this. Sharks gain no benefit from the remora tagging along. Remoras are small little fish that will basically tag alongside the sharks. The shark doesn't see it as food. The remora basically just eats the scraps. So in that example, the remora is going to eat whatever scraps come from the shark's hunting, and the remora remains unharmed. The shark doesn't benefit from that interaction whatsoever. You may have noticed that there was also a individual question. We will cover some more of these in class, and that will give us some more topics to talk about in class. But for now, we're going to jump ahead past the biomes and past the matter cycles. Those are going to all be covered in their own videos. We'll have a second one on biomes, and we'll have another one that covers the matter cycles as a review. We're going to jump to primary productivity. In primary productivity, we are talking about photosynthesis, except we are quantifying it. That's the biggest difference between discussing photosynthesis and primary productivity, is that primary productivity is the rate, meaning it's going to be over time, that an area of plant populations or community, so we're talking about the grasses, the trees, all the organisms, all the plant life in a particular area, is converting into usable energy through photosynthesis. Now, this can be expressed, as the first example here shows, in units of energy, so kilocalories or calories with the big capital C per meter squared per year. It can also be expressed in terms of matter of carbon. So when we do our lab on primary productivity, we're going to be measuring and quantifying the grams of carbon that are grown in our particular plots of grass. what we are looking for and what we are comparing here is that some areas are going to have higher primary productivity. These are going to tend to be either more biodiverse, and they're going to be typically found in climates that can be suitable for that. So we're talking about more tropical climates that get consistent warm temperatures, sunlight, and precipitation to support that growth. The ecosystems with lower primary productivity are going to have lower biodiversity. They're going to typically be in colder regions, so thinking like the tundra as an example, that don't get as much sunlight, that don't have the warm temperatures and precipitation needed to support the growth of plant life. In terms of calculating it, there are three components to it. Net primary productivity is the amount of biomass we can actually calculate, but there's two parts to that get us that number. One is gross primary productivity, and anytime we're describing something as a gross amount, it means the total, all of the things that are involved. So the gross primary productivity would be all of the energy that's converted into sugar and into stored energy through photosynthesis. The problem is plants also do respiration. So we are going to lose some of that primary productivity through the plant's own survival, breaking down its own sugars as part of cell respiration, which is why it stores sugar in the first place and does photosynthesis in the first place to support its own survival. So if we take gross primary productivity and we subtract respiration from it, we end up with the number that we're actually able to calculate, which is net primary productivity. Given most setups, we're not able to calculate the gross primary productivity, the GPP, because we can't actually capture how much CO2 is being produced by the plant life themselves. That requires a very advanced setup, and that's not something we're going to have during our lab activities. However, we are going to be able to measure and calculate what will end up being our net primary productivity. Now, when we think about net primary productivity in terms of the amount of solar energy that's actually coming in, about 99% of all solar energy is not being used by plants. So plants are really only using about 1% of the solar energy that strikes them, which means that a lot of it is passing through, bouncing off, and not being absorbed through photosynthesis. And a lot of that we experience as the heat that warms our that helps to warm our atmosphere. In reality, of the energy that plants take in, about 60% is used for themselves, and then about 40% ends up being what's stored, or what ends up quantifying and over time resulting in our net primary productivity. As we mentioned before, it's easier to see with the terrestrial biomes that we're going to talk about. The more tropical ones tend to have the highest primary productivity values. It's important to also remember that marine biomes, which we'll also talk about, also have varying levels of primary productivity. You'll see that things like swamps and marshes, as well things like swamps and marshes and coral reefs, because of the algae that are present in that small area, have high primary productivity values. The open ocean, despite being a very large area and having the most algae on the planet, is actually low in terms of productivity, because the amount of energy being captured is spread out over such a large area that it doesn't end up quantifying as a very productive area by this measure. So the things that are going to factor into this are going to be water availability, which is and higher temperature, as mentioned before, which is why tropics are going to be more suited for high primary productivity, but also nutrient availability. In places like swamps and marshes, you're going to have a lot of breakdown of organic material, a lot of decomposition, and that's going to create a lot more readily available nutrients that can be used in those areas. That brings us to discussing our trophic levels. So once we have our plant life, our plants are going to set up all of our food chains and food webs. Now, we mentioned during our early reviews of our Unit 0, our laws of thermodynamics, energy can't be created or destroyed. So in terms of plant life, they are converting that sunlight through chemical reactions into chemical energy in the form of sugar. What you're seeing on the screen is essentially the summary of photosynthesis as we know it. Now, within food webs, we're going to see that that energy does get passed up the food chain because that's what supports organisms at the higher food chain levels. But not all of it can make it up, and that leaves us with what we call a 10% rule, meaning only a certain amount of energy is passed up that food chain. Now, because only 10% of the energy, roughly, and this is a rough number we use to understand the concept, 10% of the energy from one level actually makes it to the next level. And the other 90% is what ends up being used by the organism for its own survival and what is lost as heat. For that reason, energy moves up a food chain almost like the form of a pyramid, meaning that the organisms at the bottom are going to always be in the greatest number, the primary producers, and then the primary consumers, the herbivores that eat them, are not going to be as numerous because there's just not enough energy to support that many organisms. And then as we get up to the carnivores, our secondary consumers, and then our tertiary consumers, we see that the number of organisms decreases because there's only going to be a finite amount of energy due to this 10% rule. This can also be observed in terms of biomass, as I was mentioning before. It's not just energy, but because energy restricts how many organisms can be found at the higher trophic levels, that means that we're going to find less organisms, and less organisms means less biomass. So we can apply this 10% rule to both energy and to consumers. Energy and matter as it moves through our consumers and up this particular food chain, each individual food chain and the food web itself. And we have that summarized here, what I just said. Only about 10% of the biomass is going to be supported by that available energy, since only 10% of the energy is making it up. So if we think about it in terms of 1,000 kilograms, for every 1,000 kilograms of plants, primary producers, that's going to be able to support 100 kilograms of herbivores, which can then support 10 kilograms of carnivores, our secondary consumers, which can then support 1 kilogram of tertiary consumers. So every time we move one step, and this is something that the tests like to do with different questions, is to ask things about how much energy or how much biomass would be found at a particular level in a food chain. We have to remember that every step through the food chain is 10%. In order to do that, we have a very simple calculation. We just divide everything by 10. We move the decimal point one spot. So that brings us to our last topic for this video, which is going to be food webs. A food web is a diagram that shows the flow of matter and energy within an ecosystem. So it's not just telling me where the matter is going in terms of what eats what, but it's also showing me the flow of energy. What's very important with these diagrams, and this is something that has popped up on exams before, is that the arrows indicate the direction. The arrows don't point to, we don't want to think of it as pointing to what eats what or what gets eaten by what. We want to think of it as the flow of energy and the flow of matter. So in the example here, the arrow from the thrush goes up to the eagle, which means that the thrush's energy goes to the eagle. The biomass from the thrush goes to the eagle, which means that in simpler terms, the eagle eats the thrush in this food web. Now, food webs are more dynamic, and they show the reality of nature, which is that in a food chain, one organism can get cut out due to disturbances, diseases, drought, anything like that. So in a food chain, it's not realistic because in reality, organisms within an ecosystem are going to probably have many different feeding outlets. Now, the time when that's not going to be the case is going to be when we talk about specialist species that may only have one specific food or food type that they can eat. And we'll talk about specialist species in more detail when we get there. But in general, the food web is the more representative way that we would look at food. It's going to be more representative of how we look at organisms in reality in nature, is that an organism is likely to have multiple different things, especially our the organisms that are higher up on our food chain. They're going to be more responsible. They're going to have more outlets in order to get their energy. And we don't have to think of them as basically only having the responsibility of being food to one organism and one organism only. Now, within a food web, it also gives us an idea of how organisms can change in terms of number based on changes within that food web. This brings up the topic of a keystone species, which we'll spend more time on. But if one organism increases or decreases within a specific food web, it would have an impact on all of the organisms, both above and below, in some way, shape, or form. The example here is the wolf population. So with the wolf population, and this is something that's happened in New Jersey, we have basically removed and gotten rid of all of the wolves over time. That was largely through colonial expansion. When wolves require large hunting grounds, so without those large hunting grounds, many of them died off and their populations dwindled. The result of that is that the prey of the wolf, which is the deer, the white-tailed deer we see around here all the time, grew in number and therefore eat much more plant matter since there's a much larger population, and that leads to overgrazing and a decline in tree populations and tree lines. You'll see this when you see large, denser plots of trees. It almost looks like the bottoms, the first like 10 to 15 feet of the trees, are completely bare because there's no branches over time, as those are the ones that the deer are most likely to feed on. When we talk about keystone species, we're going to see that they can also affect, these food webs can also get affected if a particular prey starts to decline. That means that an individual such as the gray wolf population will decline since it would have no food, and then the organism below it, where the decline is happening, similar to we saw on the right here, the tree population would increase rapidly. Now, that's going to take us through our first topic video on these particular parts of Unit 1, and then we will move on to the other sections of Unit 1 as well. Thank you for listening.